Pero ya estamos grabando.
José Carlos.
Denme un segundo, estoy mandando ya la señal.
Zdravka, are you all right? We are about to start.
Yes, I am all right.
Comenzamos.
Buenas tardes a todos. Nuevamente agradecemos su participación y su asistencia en este tercer Encuentro Norte-Sur Global CISAN-UNAM en nuestra tercera versión. Este encuentro es posible gracias a los PAPIIT IN 30-2020 y IA 309-20. En esta ocasión tenemos la Conferencia Magistral, Structural Change and Full Employment for Human Development, a keynesian-insitutional-feminist view of socialization of investment with social provisioning, dictada por la doctora Zdravka Todorova y como comentarista a la doctora Khanal Kalpana. Voy a leer unas pequeñas semblanzas de ambos y después les daré la bienvenida a nuestros participantes. La doctora Todorova es profesora en el Departamento de Economía en Wright State University, es miembro del Comité Asesor de la Asociación de Economía Social, miembro de la Junta Editorial del Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. Su artículo más reciente con Kalpana, Khanal, Remittances of Households in the Age of Neoliberalism Uncertainty, se publicó en el Journal of Economic Issues. Ella ha sido galardonada con el Premio Internacional Veblen, que conmemoraba el aniversario del nacimiento de Thorsten Veblen, otorgado por la Asociación Europea de Economía Política Evolucionaria y la Asociación para la Economía Evolutiva en el 2007. Ella tiene muchas publicaciones relevantes y pues estamos muy contentos de que ella nos acompañe hoy. También, por otra parte, la doctora Kalpana es profesora en Nichols College y es también ha desarrollado mucho trabajo en relación a estos temas. Ella se graduó de la Universidad de Missouri, Kansas City, y sus publicaciones están básicamente en la revista de Economía Agrícola y Aplicada, la revista de Economía de Económicas y Mandus Post. Bueno, pues les damos la bienvenida a nuestras ponentes. Thank you very much, both you, Zdravka Todorova. It's a pleasure to have you once again here via virtual, by Zoom. And Kalpana, thanks again that you are still with us. We know we will learn a lot for both of you. And please, Dr. Todorova, you have the word. Now you can start your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, Monica, for inviting me and for organizing this seminar, this conference. And thank you to CISAN and to the Economics Department at UNAM for organizing the event. And as you see, you have you seeing my PowerPoint, so I will signal perhaps when you can change the slide. First, I want to talk about the title, which is a long title, and I want to really emphasize the different parts of it. In this type of talk, we have we are synthesizing approaches that have been developing over decades and more even, of course. And then we are trying to look at an overall issue of the economy continuously changing, but also facing crisis. And so for this reason, my focus is structural change, which of course happens all the time. And of course, with respect to achieving full employment, how this concept of full employment has been changing and how it should be broadened to be focusing on human development. I focus on two concepts in my thinking about the economy. It is a socialization of investment, which is a term that comes from the general theory of John Maynard Keynes. And so it has been coming out of post-Keynesian economics, but of course expanding that concept onto broader heterodox approaches and connecting it to the notion of social provisioning, which is a concept that has been used in institutional economics, feminist economics, social economics. And so I am connecting post-Keynesian institutionalist feminist view. Of course, there are many different approaches within each. And of course, generally, my approach is to look at heterodox economics as a whole. But here, I'm taking kind of the opportunity to remind about these connections among these three schools of thought. And so I want to start with the first slide where I kind of outline briefly the three approaches and their connection. So if we can move to the first slide. Yes. So you see, if we think about post-Keynesian institutionalism and feminists, one good starting point is to start from the monetary production economy, which is central in post-Keynesian analysis. And this means that all production takes place in a capitalist economy for the purpose of pursuit of money. Of course, this is not a new concept for post-Keynesian economics that is very much outlined in Marx too. And so, but this is the central starting point where the focus also in post-Keynesian analysis has been shifting from kind of the financial constraints or the focus on constraints to focus on how to find actual real resources to address the needs in the economy. And as you know, in post-Keynesian analysis, investment is creating income and saving is a passive residual. This is the reversal of the causation that is in broadly mainstream economics. And in that theory of investment and saving, of course, the deficits or the government deficits also particularly are kind of seen as endogenous. They are following the economic activity. So there are quite a lot of elements that we can focus on each one of these schools of thought. I'm just kind of zooming and pointing this as a kind of reference points as to what actually is being connected in the overall story that I'm going to tell. Of course, as a result from post-Keynesian analysis, a major goal in terms of policy is to achieve and maintain, most importantly, full employment. So as opposed to full employment to be looked at as some sort of fixed point that we are going to achieve and try to address during crisis through some sort of temporary stimulus, the goal has emerged in many much post-Keynesian analysis to achieve a kind of to maintain a full employment. Where everybody who is willing, able, can actually find a job. I'm particularly, of course, zooming onto the literature that has developed around the job guarantee programs, and in this sense, maintaining full employment. So these are the kind of parts that are most important for my research regarding a post-Keynesian approach that I'm connecting to institutionalist and feminist. The second part, the institutionalist approach, one of the central elements in it is that it deals with living systems that we incorporate in our conceptualization of the economy. So we conceptualize the economy as a living, evolving system of economic, but also cultural change and natural change. And the focus is on a resource creation rather than a resource allocation only. And as you may know, in institutional literature, there is a basic understanding of a kind of dichotomy in valuation and understanding that there are different criteria for evaluating economic activities or value generally or economic phenomena. And those criteria are in terms of, let's say, monetary efficiency and, let's say, technical efficiency. And by technical efficiency, it's not only about machines, but also includes anything that sustains human lives. For example, environmental sustainability, how we achieve, human development and so forth. This falls into kind of a technical criteria for efficiency, as opposed to only having a kind of efficiency in terms of monetary cost, for example. So then in institutionalist theory, there is an emphasis on hierarchical distinctions within society. And what do I mean by hierarchical? So distinction is not the same as kind of differences amongst people, but it actually has to do with the social status. So class is one example, of course, but there are other ways that people continuously engage in hierarchical distinction, which means that there is a kind of a valuation that is not based on easily explained differences of outcomes, but rather are connected to norms, presumptions, assumptions. So for example, with respect to gender, race, and class, and so on, or types of occupation, and so on. And of course, this hierarchical distinction is directly connected to vested interest, the term used in Veblen. So my kind of approach from institutionalist economics is coming mostly through Veblen's analysis. But overall, institutional economics, of course, focuses on institutional change. And of course, when we talk about structural change in economics, there are many things that are covered from, for example, change in the industries, sectoral change in terms of the share of labor in the economy, types of employment and technology, and so forth. But what I want to point out that institutionalist economics bring in is that those kind of sectoral and technical changes in the economy that always happen throughout time, and of course, as a result of a major events such as, for example, the current pandemic. In institutional economics, they are connected theoretically to changes in norms, social beliefs, perceptions, expectations, and so forth. So this institutional change always involves a change of the way people think and value and perceive economic relations and people within the economy. So this structural change always involves change in culture. So then, of course, there is quite a lot of overlap from what we have been saying up until now to much of topics discussed in feminist economics. One of the emphasis in feminist economics is that there are differences in needs, but also there are commonalities in experience. So, and the commonality for all human beings, we need care, right? We need to be brought up, for example, by the help of somebody. But also there are differences in needs and impacts and experiences, as we have seen and as you have discussed in our current situation. Those become very much visible. In feminist economics, therefore, there is emphasis on empowerment and on revealing oppression. And of course, this connects to what I said with respect to institutional economics focus on hierarchical distinctions. Of course, other heterodox approaches also emphasize those. Now, from feminist economics, also what we can take is this emphasis on capabilities. And the capabilities approach, of course, is a broader approach associated with the name of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. And there are different ways in which feminist economists have engaged with the capabilities approach. So these are the kind of the main points that I am putting together in discussing overall what is the economy, what is social provisioning, which is my term basically for the economy, and then relating that to this idea in the general theory socialization of investment through the means of kind of full employment. And then, of course, what I am in this talk, what I will emphasize is some kind of conclusions or conclusive remarks regarding our current situation and what we have learned about how we view the economy and what are the objectives of the economy. So I want to continue next with the next slide, where I want to talk about the notion of human development. And of course, there is quite a lot of literature outside, of course, economics, but also within economics. And I have chosen here some points that we can use in thinking about what do we mean by human development. Now, overall, the capabilities approach, one way to look at what is important for human development is to look at what people can do and also what are their constraints, individual but also social, and what can they become or be socially. And so these capabilities has to do a lot with agency, but it's not only about individual agency. And so, but it has to do with how you can change circumstances, what you can achieve, what is your freedom of mobility, how can you react to a situation, or how can you create, how can you move. It has to do with the mobility in terms of space and mobility in terms of status or just self-achievement and so forth. And there are different ways that we can talk about human development. I have just selected to focus on those features so that we can kind of think about what is the notion of, good jobs or full employment, what do we get out of this economy in terms of at the end, the objective of the economy is we are alive and we perpetuate life and so forth. So everybody is concerned with some sort of community, but also situation, how this is very much connected to health, individual health, but also how that is sustained through community. And of course, community and health, this has to do a lot with our relation to nature. So this kind of connection to others in nature is a significant part of what we can call human development. Then belonging and individuality, they go hand in hand, although they may seem opposite. So when you belong to a group, but also you want to have a sense of self. So when we think about individual jobs, a lot of time obviously is spent on the job. And so you would like that to feel also as a belonging to something, right? But also you want to have individual discretion and so forth. So there is obviously huge literature on that with respect to the organization, work relations, and so forth. And generally within any of the economic activities that we undertake, this is a kind of part of also what drives people's in their economic activity. The fourth factor is creativity, workmanship, curiosity. I think it's important to recognize that individuals, of course, engage in leisure, recreation, and so forth, and as well as they're driven to create, to produce, and to work. And to a large extent, obviously, most of us engage in some sort of work or trying to get at least to work. And to what extent this work allows for this creativity, allows for this feeling proud that you have created something good, meaning workmanship, and also drives curiosity or the learning processes. In other words, the sense of feeling that you are contributing, developing, and growing. And also, of course, the expression, individual expression, artistic expression, and so forth. And finally, care is a part of central to our economy in this type of analysis. And of course, it cannot be separated from generally livelihood and security. So when we think about security of economic security and so forth, we often neglect the part of care. And with this pandemic crisis, we see very clearly that those are not separate. So this is just to start to think about one way to think about what I mean human development. And I want to go now to the next part, to the next slide, to discuss more particularly, so having this in mind, these elements of human development, thinking about this connection between socialization of investment and full employment. As we said, in the general theory, socialization of investment was very narrowly defined, obviously, because the objectives were, for Keynes, were to work within largely the mainstream marginalist analysis, and to say how the thinking about the recessions and general macroeconomy has to change, where money and investment central, and to achieve full employment. And so in these discussions, Keynes put an emphasis on the importance of having resources in the economy driven towards the production rather than speculation. And out of this analysis, it came out the argument for socialization of investment. So he referred to it as the euthanasia of the rentier. In other words, driving the price or the remuneration from liquid assets and speculation, and generally what he called driving the interest rate down to zero, so that when you compare returns or expected returns, you go and choose to invest in productive assets or in assets that are used in production for achieving full employment. So his focus was on basically stimulating private production investment. Okay, so after a while, post-Keynesians, obviously and up until today, broaden the focus, and especially when it's in collaboration with institutional and with feminist economics, we have a much more, we have the tools to have a much more broader view of socialization of investment. And I will say that even once we have this human development aspect, we can start thinking beyond the sort of investment only, but thinking about what is the objective. The objective is this life that we want to lead according to, let's say, the elements that I just talked about in human development. And so one of the proposals that came out of post-Keynesian and institutionalist literature was the job guarantee programs. And there is quite a lot of literature. I can lead you if you want to give you further directions in that literature. But that's a program that aims to have kind of locally developed full employment programs or job guarantee programs that start from the lower level in terms of skills, that have a fixed living wage, and that they are oriented towards community and local needs. But they are funded, they are secured at the macro level. Okay, they are not funded by local tax, they are secured at their macro policy with a micro concern or element. So then within this, obviously, then once we have into consideration the objective is not just to achieve full employment, but to maintain full employment. The second important objective is to address actually something meaningful with the jobs and to create meaningful lives for the people who at that time couldn't find jobs in the private sector. So that they don't lose their training and so forth, so that they're part of community, so that they don't have gaps and they don't drop out of labor force. But then when we consider that these will be meaningful jobs, this means connection to community, to environment, to specific needs. And then, of course, the job guarantee literature emphasized that this is permanent, and like the content and the way it is organized is going to be evolutionary, like institutionalists say, but the commitment is permanent. If you want to work, and if it's a capitalist economy, here you go, and we can also address something with our creativity. We can design it locally, where it's not just like digging holes and filling them in, like Keynes made fun of this type of, he was making fun of the idea that we don't have human creativity to actually go and find a need that we can address. So instead of stabilizing credit markets during times of crisis, there is and of course there could be a need to stabilize credit markets, but the point is achieving full employment through indirect ways to stabilizing, let's say, financial markets is a very indirect way, and also doesn't have these aspects that I talked about community environment need. But also we want to expand even beyond Keynes, who focused on kind of private investment, right? So the private investment is one way of producing output in the economy. But nonetheless, when we address other needs that are not a part of investment decisions per se, they also support private investment. I'm not going to discuss this now here, but I'm just saying that there is no kind of a trade-off or duality between private investment and needs. It's just that the only focus on private investment is narrow. And for this reason, post-Keynesian economics is broadened very usefully by institutionalist and feminist analysis. So the challenges are in this type of program, how to address care needs within and outside the program. It's easier said than done, especially under condition of COVID-19. I'm not going to resolve this issue here, but I'm just saying that this is the day, this is now is the time to design and to address those things. Now is the time to emphasize, do you see that the care economy is not in the household only, it's the foundation of our overall economy. And that becomes more obvious. So therefore, whatever policy we design, it has to be, it cannot ignore this. So, of course, another point, and that it's more obvious today, access to healthcare cannot be the subject only to access to employment, right? So especially during crisis, this is even more obvious, but even in normal times, this link should be severed for many reasons. But during public health crisis, we also saw that access to livelihood cannot be also subject to access to employment. So even if we have a full employment program, right? When we have a public health crisis right like now, that doesn't quite address all the problems, right? So this is another kind of challenge. So if full employment is not enough, but we need also, we saw emergency response infrastructure. So that infrastructure, in a sense, can benefit from full employment, job guarantees, so that we build this type of response infrastructure, preparedness, and so forth. But in other words, this type of reliance only on employment is not sufficient. In fact, during this crisis, production to a large point stopped in many areas, and that was kind of the initial point, is we have to stay home or whatever. So then, you know, that is not a kind of a single-minded solution to any type of crisis. And I want to point out here that I think that this infrastructure of emergency response is in fact inhibited by the continuous focus that our economists, and I'm generalizing here, but I know that global capitalist economists increasingly have focused basically on following the financial markets, and the valuation of the creditors have been upheld as a kind of the most important criterion for decisions for macro policy and so forth. And so that in a sense inhibits the preparedness for such infrastructure to occur. I want to remind you of Michael Kaletsky. He had this very nice term, target economy. And in a sense, if you want to go and read the next slide with quotes by Michael Kaletsky, he was writing in 1940s, right? And then he, of course, was writing about the rise of the fascist economy. And he called it at that time that this is a target economy, targeting on the military industry, the production of weaponry. And so he said, well, we can achieve full employment in that way, perhaps, right? But of course, that's not a good way. That's not a way consistent with human development, correct? And so he was basically saying that such a fascist system of his time starts with overcoming of unemployment, developed into armament economy, but of scarcity, he calls it, and then it ends up in war. Now, of course, we can think about more contemporary context in these terms, of militarization and war and so forth, but we can also think of target economy is different type of economy. So for example, if we target the economy in terms of relying on financial markets, this is an example of a target economy, okay? And what, of course, feminist institutionalist economists emphasize, especially feminist economists, that care should be the foundation. And how to support that. So the point that Kaletsky was making is that increasingly directing resources to a particular sector, and what of course I'm pointing out, obviously, that doesn't prepare you, depending on whatever the sector is, it doesn't necessarily prepare you to react to a kind of a livelihood or human life crisis, like for example in the current situation. And just to finish up with the last quote, which is nicely stated, the fight of the progressive forces for full employment, Kaletsky says, is at the same time a way of preventing the recurrence of fascism. But how does the progressive forces for full employment? So you can have full employment in different ways, right? And that's why I want to emphasize in the next slide that how we think about social provisioning should be seen. It's important so that we don't kind of idealize these terms, full employment, social provisioning, and so forth. So we can see the next picture. And so if you think about the long title that I gave you, it's long because I wanted to summarize the whole thing. Oftentimes, of course, the terms social and provisioning sound good, right? And so we kind of associate them with positive thing. And on one hand, we want to see our economy is providing for the needs in an economy. But I emphasize a somewhat different view of social provisioning, which is basically to say the whole economy embedded in culture and in nature. Or generally the economic activity includes all sorts of motivations. So social provisioning is not only about sustaining and caring the economy, in the economy. So when we talked about full employment, we just said that full employment can be achieved in different ways. And I think the job guarantee program is one way to get out of this problem of a target economy and actually to look at the local needs. Then structural change, like we said, it's always going on. We are having currently yet another structural change, right? But the outcomes are ambivalent. So the conflation of home and work on one hand is liberating, on the other hand is also oppressive and so forth. So all sorts of structural changes can happen that oppress somebody at the expense of others. Then with respect even to human development, we can have a notion of human development where, let's say, it's very patriarchal, we're very single-minded. It could be like, let's make the workers happier so that we extract more out of them or direct their attention to our creativity as opposed to what's good for them. So, I mean, what I want only to point out with this slide is that we should not idealize any of those things. They are all open and contested. And that is why, for me, the most useful way of looking at social provisioning is, rather than make it equal to providing a safety net or the care economy and so forth, is to basically look at the economy as a social provisioning is comprised by many processes that happen. They can be positive and negative. So this is a kind of my view of what social provisioning is. If you go to the next picture, I just will give you a snapshot of that, and I will not go in detail, but I can distribute later those slides. You can see that what I call social provisioning processes in the middle, the so-called, I call them economic, comprised by many different processes. And so those inherently are not necessarily good, bad, and so forth. Even care can have very negative elements. You can be forced to care for somebody, right? Or you can be very paternalistic and oppressive when you care, and so forth. I'm not going to go in detail, but I'm just telling you that we can conceive the whole economy and based on economic activities embedded within these social and cultural and natural processes. And so I have envisioning sort of this economy is comprised by those social provisioning processes in connection to the so-called social, such as gender process, social, class, race, ethnicity, and so forth. And this outlined in a different, in a specific article that you can look in detail. And then, of course, within the natural ecosystems and within the processes that actually underline economic agents and their bodies. as well as physical space. The point of this is so that we don't kind of end up in kind of idealizing or opposing the so-called care economy to either markets and so forth. Within all of these, you have markets, you have capital accumulation, which takes place throughout all of these processes. The point is, when we talk about addressing these current needs of full employment, human development, and so on, to be conscious that those can take a different direction. Those maybe seem progressive, they can be equated with social safety net, but they can be also oppressive, depends. So we have to be thinking of those things. Now, if you go to the next one, I want to outline now some specific elements of how many heterodox economists really, and how particularly I see the analysis, what are the elements of social provisioning analysis. And again, to remind that this includes the social provisioning is the social processes through which people provide for each other, including care, exploit, and oppress each other again. And so I can kind of identify 6 elements that I think important for a different type of analysis to exit the, let's say, mainstream analysis, and to think about more innovative way, more realistic way to address current problems of livelihood. And so then I will relate briefly those to some questions that emerged during our current public health crisis. So first, care is central and fundamental. And I want to emphasize that we should accept that there are some universalities within the economy. We spend so much time discussing differences and specific contexts, which is extremely important. But I think we need to emphasize universality. One universality is everybody, when they get born, they need care and so forth. And this is not the only type of care. Care is also within the market and the workplace and so forth, different types. But the point is, this is the starting point. It's not savings, okay? Saving is a residual out of economic activity, and before even economic activity take place, you have one particular economic activity called care. And even, I mean, you have a birth process, and then you have to take care. So this is the central point and starting point in the economy. Then the notion, second, the notion of social product, or also social surplus, if we talk about accumulation type of economy. So a social product, the point is resources are created socially. Knowledge is socially created. The distribution will be organized, whatever social organization. This is so basic. Obviously, I'm not the first one to say this. I mean, going back to the classical political economists, and this is obvious, but I don't think that this is present in much of economic analysis, and also in the way conventional wisdom has become to think about inventing and creating, or rather coming up with resources as if individuals are creating it. The organization of the distribution of the social product also kind of impacts the solutions that we're able to create. The third, this is about differences and distinctions. So when we think about social provisioning is a framework of analysis, there is a need to recognize that there are different needs, obviously. And, this comes a lot out of feminist economics, obviously. Of course, I already pointed out some universal need, but also differences are different from distinctions. So recognizing individual differences is for the purpose of recognizing needs, circumstances, and experiences. It's extremely important to recognize that today different people are experiencing this crisis in many different ways. And then why is that? Often is because of pre-existing hierarchical distinction that is even deepening today with the crisis, and new hierarchies may be created. So this way of looking at inequality necessarily goes into the structural or systemic inequalities. It's very different how we analyze inequities. The fourth element is, and this is like I emphasize particularly in my writing, this notion of processes. So when we talk about the differences in the hierarchical distinctions, oftentimes this ends up at the analysis of identity, or let alone, of course, demographic differences. Beyond that, we can think about categories, but category is such a static way of thinking about it. Identity is such a limited way of thinking about gender or ethnicity and race and so forth. It's not only what's going on in our minds, and even in the capability approach, this is acknowledged, of course. And so what I emphasize is looking at those so-called social differences as processes. And remembering the big picture of the process, systems of process, I have put gender, race, ethnicity, economic or social class, citizenship, worship, kinship, language as process, meaning that over time, what we call race, for example, or gender, they have emerged in certain circumstances. We were talking about experiences and social organizations of production and distribution of social product, not just about individual identities and how people feel about themselves, or perception about the other, and not even only about discrimination, which is at the end outcome of all those developments in the process. Of course, this is not just to point out the negative. There is the positive also, right? I mean, in a sense of what are the capabilities that people can achieve when they realize or when they actualize something together. So the fifth one, the nature culture, and I already kind of showed you in my picture, the simple realization that the society and economy are one and are embedded. I never could understand when people separate the social from the economy. I don't see any difference anymore. And of course, embedded within nature. And then the individual agent embodies nature. It's a nature itself. And so this is what we call the life process that mostly comes out of institutional economics. And finally, this is, I think, kind of the final element that leads us to realize that diverse economic relations have to be acknowledged, that they sustain our economy, and in a way that they are not actually opposed. When I say diverse relations, I don't mean that they're isolated from each other, but that they are different, and that we have to recognize that our economy is sustained by different types of sustaining the material life in the economy. In other words, it's not only market transacting, it's not only buying and selling, right? We know. We have also communal sharing. And communal sharing, by the way, is not only good, but it has to be recognized it is outside of market calculation. Then there is equity matching. So for example, reciprocity. Even there is no buying and selling, there is some sort of a keeping track in your mind about how much I gave, how much you gave. This is called equity matching. We can say reciprocity. And finally, another economic relation is the authority ranking. So for example, debt and credit relations, they have to do with the power and authority. So this is a very big, small cliff note as to what are the types of economic relations, and they are based on coming out of psychology on Fiske's work, this particular outline, but also we have seen different variations in heterodox economics. My point here is all of those together contain or represent the elements of what I call social provisioning analysis. All of those, yes, lead us to thinking about solutions in this more open way. And so I referred already a number of times to process, right? And what is a process? So when I say a gender process or when I say that care is a process and so forth, the point is that it's not just an activity, like for example, care is not just an activity, or it's not just an identity, for example, like let's say gender, but each process may contain this kind of analytical category that I have listed here. And then we can analyze this as a kind of evolutionary and also very much localized in terms of context-specific changes over time that are amalgamation of activities, identities, conventions, working rules and procedures, norms, beliefs, signs, symbols, or even conventional wisdom and rhetorical devices and so forth. All of these brings us outside of thinking about just demographic differences and attributes and thinking, where is this person situated? You know, what are the symbols that represent them and so forth. And so this is just a cliff note. I articulate a little bit more what's the process in this paper that I have given to you here. And I think it's important when we start looking at these questions of intersectionality and so forth to have more of a process approach than an approach of categories. Categories, I feel like they're too fixed of analytical concept. And so if you can go to the next kind of more towards the conclusion, we can basically now remember how I told you about these different elements of social provisioning that I discussed. And I want to relate those to what sort of questions do we have after or during COVID-19 regarding those different elements of what constitutes social provisioning. So the first one was care, and I think that one observation that has become very difficult to deny is that household lives are not separate from work and production. As simple as that sounds, and as much as feminist economists have been talking already for decades and decades about that, very difficult to deny nowadays with these experiences, right? So then this brings the question, what is the meaning of full employment? I'm just going to bring those as questions. I'm not going to be answering them, right? But these are the questions that we now, as post-Keynesian and so forth, embellished by institutionalists and feminists, we should be working on. Then the second, the social product, all solutions are social, right? We just have denied that because of the specific social organization of distribution that we had. And so when we talk about addressing something, it's always about infrastructure. And so infrastructure, obviously not only in terms of roads and so forth, we can think about supply chains, we can think about care, labor. I mean, how do you provide actually those things? It's about how do we create and distribute the social product. So when we think about the essential or frontline workers, it's here, they call them in the United States. Is this a new phenomenon? No, those people always have been on the front line, of course, much more dangerous and exacerbated now. The point is that we are unveiling what was there, and now we cannot ignore it. Well, we kind of can, right? We can, there is inequities, that prevent some from fully experiencing the negatives and puts other into a situation where they don't have much choice. But the point is that nonetheless we see it better, the inequities. And then this leads to the question also, in all of these essential, non-essential, whatever, are financial markets essential, and for what? These are the sort of the crises haven't been made easier to see. Of course, all sorts of explanations and ignoring come with it too. I combine 3 and 4 here, the differences, distinctions, because I connect them directly to the processes, because that's how we see the hierarchical distinctions and the differences amongst people better through the prism of process, like I pointed out before. And so recognizing or addressing those is about systemic inequalities, addressing, right? The 5th one, how could a nature culture, how could any policy today anymore not account for human beings and ecosystems? It's, I'm talking basically about the level of policy formulation and changing our economic theories also. And the 6th one, the diverse economic relations that I talked about, communal sharing, market transacting, authority ranking, and equity matching, they should be even more obvious now. And how can those change the scope of our economic analysis? And also, of course, just recognizing and acknowledging the different contributions in the economy outside of monetary valuation. To me, it is just so limiting to lump everything under market transaction and to explain, especially in the face of what we see, how the economies are sustained by other relations too, especially in times of crisis when those market transactions disappear almost. I will leave you with that, except the last slide, I only kind of put the bibliography, the work and the papers that I have published around those topics. And so if you want those, I mean, I have provided copies of the PowerPoint and you can look at them. So I will leave for comments now and questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Todorova, for your talk. It gives us a lot of questions to rethinking economics, and it's not easy. Well, now we will have time for Dr. Kalpana. So she will make a few comments on your presentation. Thank you. We give you the talk. To Kalpana, please.
Thank you, Dr. Mayo. And thank you, Dr. Todorova, for your very empowering presentation. It was very thought-provoking, and I found your your theoretical framework very empowering. As I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about different developing country scenarios where we could use this framework. And specifically as an economist who have been interested in the field of development economics, under quotes, right? The traditional notion of development has been very limiting, right? And under this context, the framework that Dr. Todorova has proposed is offers an evolutionary solution to the traditional notion of development and economic change. And in her presentation, she has tried to tie together 3 main ideas, right? First is she's trying to expanding the notion of post-Keynesian thought, where she is expanding Keynes's notion of socialization of investment. In general theory, in the last chapter, Keynes gives space for the governments to enter and then provide for people, right? Social provisioning. And but expanding Keynes's traditional notion of socialization of investment, Dr. Todorova proposes that that concept could be expanded and it could be connected to social provisioning, which could be an evolving concept, right? And this joins us to institutional economists, the original institutional economists. Here we have to separate this from the new institutional economists who tend to focus more on the contracts and private property rights as institutions. Rather, original institutional economists see economy as embedded in the culture. So the Polanyian notion of embeddedness, right? And market cannot be independent from society and culture, as well as everything is evolving and is context specific. So that's also very empowering. So these ideas, the notion of structural change, and when we try to design full employment program, we cannot just propose a blanket solution in every other country, right? The solution for full employment that we propose in United States is going to be different for Mexico, and that for India, and that for Nepal and Argentina. And I thought that was very intriguing, as well as she brings in feministic economics, which is another empowering thing. Oftentimes, mainstream economists and even sometimes heterodox economists fail to bring in this notion of intersectionality. They tend to forget the care economy. And if we look at the developed world as well as the developing world, there is this whole informal sector where care exists, right? And now in some of the theories, mainstream and heterodox economists are trying to bring care, but just as a postscript, which is not going to help. Because as Dr. Todorova mentioned, right, sometimes the way we bring care into the theoretical discussion could be empowering or could be impressive. And for that matter, I also like to bring in Nancy Fraser's notion of triple movement, right? As society changes, there is this double movement, but then if we fail to see the triple movement, if there is empowerment or not, then that could be challenging and in the reverse direction. So it's important to ensure that, when we bring in intersectionality, when we bring in care, when we bring in issues of people at the margins, such as people who are facing, caste-based, gender-based oppressions in the society, those policies have to be more empowering the marginalized group rather than, oppressing those groups and portraying them more as someone who needs to be rescued, right? So, as Dr. Todorova presented, I was thinking about how her ideas, she proposed a theoretical framework, right? But as she presented it as a development economist who works specifically in Southeast Asia, right? I was envisioning how her framework could be expanded at a more applied level, right, to a specific country. And now I'm going to share a little bit how I envisioned applying her idea to Southeast Asia, specifically countries such as Nepal, right? And also she mentioned Kaleki's idea of target economy, right? So that kind of provides us an evolutionary framework. And we can use this idea to design programs such as full employment or any other kind of development programs, right? Targeting the specific economy. For example, Southeast Asia and specifically Nepal is a caste-based society, right? Where certain group of people have been at the bottom of the power hierarchy. So in Nepal, it would be very important to prioritize intersectionality approach and implement full employment policies targeting this group which has been marginalized since centuries, right? And also, let's say, when I think of, let's say, a country like Mexico, right? Also, there are some group of people right now in Mexico too that have been oppressed by the colonizers since ancient times, right? So probably it would be a good idea to bring programs that kind of target them, that empower them, right? Not just use them as from the victim mentality lens, rather, empower them so that they can participate in the economy equally. And also targeting agency, right? Empowering people at the individual level as well as at the community level is important. And let me look at a few other points. And another thing that I found intriguing is that, oftentimes many theories tend to focus on the financial constraint, right? And most of the mainstream ideas of change focus on creating credit market, financializing the economy, right? But it's important to ensure that our nature, right? People, like our programs, are in coherence with nature, right? Environment, culture, things like that. So there has to be that intersection of subsistence, environment, culture, etc. And I also like that how she brought the capability approach, and it had several frameworks, right? Individuality, capabilities, creating workmanship, curiosity, care, integrating everything. So in that sense, I thought her frameworks provides a very holistic notion of change, right? And this notion is evolutionary, is very context specific, and I see that we could apply her framework to, let's say, Mexico or to Nepal or even to United States. So thank you, Dr. Todorova, for a very insightful presentation. And I look forward to building your theoretical framework in, country-specific studies, including, Saudi Asia itself. So don't be surprised if I approach you to, collaborate on a paper where we can expand your theoretical framework. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kalpana, and or Dr. Khanal, I guess, even though I know you. Thank you very much for your comments. I mean, this is the next step. I'm very happy to see that if you can find useful, more integrated approach. I do think many feminists and institutionalists have been working, but oftentimes the post-Keynesian part, I think sometimes is left out. And even though post-Keynesian is limited, I think when it's left out, it's also limiting for broader feminist approaches. And that's why I wanted to emphasize these three building blocks. But thank you, and it's nice seeing you and hearing from you again.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Monica and Claudia, for the opportunity.
Thank you, both of you, for your insights. This is really, really important work you are doing, both of you, especially in this moment when we are facing a social crisis, health crisis, economic crisis, environmental crisis, and even civilizatory crisis, especially this year. And it's where we should have some alternatives to the current system and current capitalist system, and where the financialization and the open market focusing have placed the whole world just to rethink where who we are as a society, as a human beings. So we will now collect some questions from the public. I think we have a very interested questions here. Some from Dr. Mireles, Dr. Monica Mireles. She said, thank you very much for your talk. Could you please comment if human development in a post-Keynesian institutional feminist perspective could be fully achieved in capitalism, even considering that we are in a scenario of ideal social provisioning? This is one question for both of you. And also we have another question from Monica. Having in mind recent publications that address the controversy of Keynesian political thought, do you think it is correct to see Keynes as a non-Marxist socialist? And I have one more from Emilio Alba. Let me tell you, Zdravka, that he is your fan. And he's who is promoting your work and your books, and is putting me in a difficult place because now I am his dissertation tutor. So, well, I will address this question to you. Thank you for your insights, Dr. Todorova. I have some questions. The first one, what do you think of Veblen's conspicuous consumptions as a force for structuring this distinction, in the hierarchy of today's capitalist society? Are this consumption and the propensity of emulation still important for forces in a contemporary society? And the second one, William Druger says that institutionalism is the economy of the conflict between opposing interests. There is a way to achieve profound changes in the hegemonic social provision model through a peaceful way. Those are the 4 questions I place on the table. And after that, I have a couple questions for you both. Thank you.
So do you want me, Kalpana, to answer, to try to answer briefly all, and then I'll let you also chime in. Is this okay?
Sure, definitely.
I see those questions as related. The first question is human development possible within capitalism? Remembering that human development notions can change and change over time, right? And also remembering that the capitalist economy, and there are other economies like that, are hierarchical economies, a class-based economies. Naturally, within any class-based economy where the social surplus is distributed according to whatever norms of the empowers, most importantly, of the classes, some will have more capabilities and others will have less. And by that capabilities, I don't mean individual abilities and whatnot, but more access to resources and power. So yes, human development is possible, but one aspect is going to be missing always. And by missing, I don't mean completely missing, but it will be lagging behind. That is the community capabilities related to community in terms of participation, of course, with respect to access to resources and so forth. But when even if you access fully everything you need, you know that you're part of an economy that in its community has people who are deprived. So that, and I don't want to reduce it only to well-being in terms of perceptions of utility and whatever, but yes, that is incomplete human development, even for those who are at the top in terms of accessing resources and self-actualization. The knowledge that we have deprivation is an incomplete or lack of an element of human development. Is it possible? No. I think the best way to go forward is to address those scopes of how we formulate the problems and the answers and the questions. And in the example of the job guarantee program, this is just one step to recognize and to address some of those deprivations. So I think I think our best way is to address the issues, and addressing the issue by recognizing it's a systematic problem or systematic inequality, and just addressing them systematically. So then this leads me to the second question about Keynes. And as far as I understand, the question was, is Keynes a non-Marxist socialist? This is, I can spend a long time on this question, but let me start with that. A fundamental point in Keynes was that he is working towards a theory that puts money at the center. And he was discussing the monetary production economy, right? And that was my starting point. All of those kind of schema, those reasoning, this is in Marx, right? So the MCM prime, the MCM prime is the monetary production economy that Keynes is talking about. Of course, Keynes is not talking it about in the terminology of Marx, and because he didn't want to do that. So Keynes was not a Marxist, and you correctly say is non-Marxist. Was he socialist? I don't think he was, and probably doesn't quite matter what he was and what was not. But I think that his analysis built directly on the Marxian conception, basically, of the capitalist economy. And that's what Keynes wanted, is to have a more realistic conception of the so-called entrepreneurial economy, he called it, right? Didn't use the word so much capitalist, but entrepreneurial economy. And then Keynes also was emphasizing the so-called euthanasia of the rentier. By that simply, he meant the so-called socialization of investment. To remind you, this was the same topic that Ricardo was dealing with when Ricardo argued that the interest, or the rent on land, was appropriated from the overall social surplus rather than creating the social surplus. So then, of course, that was further developed by Marx arguing that also capital was doing the same thing. And so Marx had the exploitation theory, a labor theory of value. Now, Keynes doesn't have any of those exploitation at all in terms of discussion in the theory, because like I said, his objective was to talk to the mainstream, and he was a mainstream kind of an elite person who narrowed his objective within the neoclassical marginalist theory to make the point that that theory is not relevant for capitalist economy, okay? And then he basically explained that this is because it's a monetary production economy. And he basically also adopted this Ricardian, in a sense, point about appropriation by his argument of the socialization of investment, or euthanasia of the rentier, with different language that created many problems. And of course, the point is not to follow fully Keynes. Many post-Keynesians later on combined Marx, Keynes together, and so forth. So Keynes gave us what he could, whatever he wanted. He was by no means like a champion of the, he was not into, he didn't have good words to say much, I think, about working class generally and so forth. But the point is that his analysis were concerned about inequality, right? Which is a one way to approach. What we do with Keynes is a whole other thing. I think it's extremely important to follow Keynes back, to the development of political economy, and to connect him to that. And then what post-Keynesians and so forward did is the result of what varieties of analysis we have, and then the links to other schools of thought, including to Marxism and so forth. And that's simply, I think at some point it comes about theoretical and conceptual kind of languages. And of course, you always get to the point, what do we do? Well, you can do all sorts of things. I mean, you can engage in protests, you can engage in confronting inequities, prejudice, discrimination in your everyday life. You can engage in teaching the concepts, the histories, and so forth. And you can engage in policy proposal to the extent that people can or development of programs and so forth. You cannot probably do everything. Just to point out to students not to feel like you have to do everything, but that's why people have different, just different projects. Of course, within this separation or division of labor, some are more privileged than others, we know that. But was Keynes a non-Marxist socialist? He was non-Marxist, but he had a Marxist, he was influenced by Marx and by just generally the classical political economy, and his work can be absolutely consistent. His elements, when I say work, I don't mean every single word, but whatever his conclusion is, can be absolutely consistent with anybody who is sympathetic with what a modern socialist will want, which is other big topic. These are such a loaded terms nowadays that how we define socialism also is important. So going now, if I can, to the question about that Claudia pointed out, conspicuous consumption. As you know, Claudia, or others, to remind you. So this is one of my kind of favorite topics that I wrote about conspicuous consumption, that is a generally form of invidious distinction, which is a broader characteristic. And it's not just about the brands and so forth, not only about only consumption, it's always about class and emulation, as you pointed out. It can take different forms, and it exists at even at the lowest incomes, right? So I think I kind of a little bit forgot what exactly was the question about, but can conspicuous is conspicuous consumption related to the current hierarchical, distinction? Yes, this is one part of what I called here hierarchical distinction. It's and it's not only about the goods you consume, it's about also the time, what Veblen called conspicuous leisure, and what also he called conspicuous waste. And conspicuous waste is not only about consumption activities, but it could be also the type of occupation. So the type of activities that demonstrate basically that somebody can command kind of the directions of others' energies and creativities to their own ends. And yes, this is directly related to the vested interest that you pointed out. William Dagger talks about opposing interest. And like I said, my analysis is heavily based on Veblen, and vested interest in Veblen was central. Veblen had a book called Vested Interest in the Common Man. You can rename this in Marxist terms if you want, in terms of just, but I like Veblen's terms also. They have another level of richness that I'm not going to be just delving into, but I would say that that is a central, and not just in a capitalist economy. I don't want to have a kind of a, only if we deal away with capitalism that somehow hierarchy goes away. Well, it depends, right? I would say that, however, it's central to recognize this point of distinction and not to relegate the topic, for example, of conspicuous consumption as some sort of irrational, interesting, catchy topic. Conspicuous consumption is directly related to power relation within our economy. Even within the socialist economies, by the way, there was conspicuous consumption that was directly related to whatever structure their hierarchy was in whichever economy you have. So for me, that's why it has been always a central topic, and that's all my interest kind of started out of consumption and relating it to hierarchy, classes, and so on, and bringing to the whole system of processes that I discussed. So for me, it's central. So I will let Kalpana say something if she wants.
Thank you very much, Dr. Todorova. Kalpana, we are running out of time, so could you just make your comments in 5 minutes, 6 minutes?
Sure, I won't take that long. I just wanted to add, something, right? So this discussion, these 3 questions and Zdravka's answer to those questions reminded me of our late professor mentor, John Henry, right? So the question is whether Keynes, Veblen, Marx, right? Whether they were consensus theorists or not. And especially here we are discussing Keynes and Veblen, right? Keynes definitely did not want to get rid of the capitalist system, right? The time he wrote the book right after Great Depression, right? Great Depression was the time when we were in the verge of the capitalist system was going through a huge crisis. We are in the verge of another one, but then now we already have general theory. But right after Great Depression, when Keynes wrote General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, right? The purpose of the book was to save capitalism from its own destruction, right? In the last chapter, he talked about socialization of investment, the notion of euthanasia of the rentier. Keynes had read and was influenced by works of Marx, but definitely he was a capitalist and he wanted to save capitalism, right? He definitely had no intention of getting rid of capitalism as a system. So that's my understanding. But as Zdravka said, post-Keynesians are a different breed and they have tried to expand his idea to different levels, right? And again, the notion of public purpose, right, that Kenneth Galbraith, Senior Galbraith proposed, which can be an evolving concept, can be very useful concept, but still within the broader capitalist economy, right? Whereas Veblen, I think, is more, he's not a consensus theory. He's proposing for alternative system and trying to explain, some of the ideas. Of course, he is within the capitalist system, but his ideas could be very evolutionary, and he was well ahead of his time, right? So that's one thing I just wanted to add to the discussion.
And mute yourself, Claudia.
Yeah, it's what I understood from our classes in Young Casey. Keynes tried to save capitalism. Marx tried to kill it. Well, thank you very much. We are very pleasant to have you here. We learn a lot. I think for this topic, we just need another big conference of 5 days, not just 3 days. It's a lot of things to talk about and to rethink economics. So thank you very much, Zdravka, Todorova. Thank you very much, Kalpana, Khanal, for having you, for accepting participate in this third Encounter North-South. Thank you for the rest of our audience. We will have, the next activity we will have is a presentation of my book. So if you want to keep with us, just stay connected. Otherwise, thank you very much. Bueno, muchísimas gracias a toda nuestra audiencia. Nuestra próxima actividad tendrá lugar a las 2 de la tarde y arrancaremos con la presentación de mi libro para después terminar con la presentación de los tesistas. Muchísimas gracias a nuestras 2 conferencistas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Monica and Claudia, both.
Thank you.